Bom dia to my Brazilian compañeros, and of course, hello, adab to everyone else in every time zone across the world. My name is Anusia Sengupta, and I'm the co-founder and co-director with Adeli Godoy Brana and our fantastic team of Whose Knowledge, a multilingual global campaign to center the knowledges of marginalized communities online. And as we like to remind the world, marginalized through structures of historical and ongoing power and privilege, but we are the minoritized majority of the world. It is my pleasure, joy, and honor as a Wikimedian, as a Wikipedian, as a Wikidata contributor to be talking to you all today at WikiDataCon 2021. And I will, as is often my practice as a Wikimedian, be offering this talk to you in a spirit of tough love on decolonizing Wikidata and why knowledge justice as a frame, rather than simply knowledge equity or knowledge representation, matter for Wikidata and structured data as a whole. But first, let me start by congratulating Wikidata for being 9 years old and Wikimovimento Brazil for this wonderful hosting of WikiDataCon 2021, especially for challenging us with a reimagining Wikidata from the margins track. So parabéns to everyone. There is no other 9-year-old in the world that Alexa and Siri listen to with as much attention as Wikidata. And this slide is based on a fabulous Wikidata query and project that the Brazilians have been working on of terreiros, of mapping and locating the different Afro-Brazilian religions in Bahia, which is a state in Brazil, larger than the size of Spain. And I will come back to some of its implications later on. But this is one version of the celebration of what Wikidata can do for us, uncovering and representing worlds that many of us do not know, reminding us that the Black diaspora in Brazil is the largest Black people's diaspora in the world. But before I come to Wikidata, let me just give you a little context of why we do the work we do and a little bit around how we do it as well. So in terms of knowledge infrastructures, of which Wikidata is a key and growing part of the internet, we might all know, because we're Wikimedians, that most of the world is now online, even though we are online in different ways. Most of us are online through mobile phones rather than PCs and browsers, but 60% of the world is definitely now online. And of that 60%, 3/4 are from the global south, from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, and the Caribbean and Pacific Islands. 48% of all women are now online. And yet, when we look at who is in leadership at the infrastructures of the internet, we find, of course, unsurprisingly and unfortunately, that this is very limited to primarily white men from the global north, from Europe and North America. So only 5% of all leadership positions in the tech sector are held by women, of course, disproportionately held again by white men and brown men in some cases, and only 6% of technical workers, for instance, at Apple, are Black, even fewer at Facebook and Google. If you look at the institutions that govern the internet, the same sad story continues. The vast majority of documents published and therefore thinking of the IETF, or the Internet Engineering Task Force, comes from Europe and North America. And at the ICANN meeting in 2019, which is of course the nonprofit that governs our domains, only 27% were women. In other words, the infrastructures of the internet does not and do not look or sound like many of us in the world, like most of us in the world. What does that mean for the way we think about knowledge justice and knowledge injustices? So Google, a few years ago, did a projection of how many books have been published in the world, and they found approximately 130 million books in mostly 480 languages. Most of those languages are what I call Eurolingual. And as many of us know, there are over 7,000 languages in the world. And for those of us who are Wikimedians, we know this very well because we are bilingual, multilingual, extraordinary linguists in many cases. We know that to speak and know in a language, to be in a language, is to speak and know differently than in another language. So language is a proxy for knowledge. When you think and do and be in Brazilian Portuguese, you are thinking and doing and being in a different way. You are inhabiting the world in a different way than when you are thinking and doing and being in English. So as a proxy, with a simple calculation, only 7% of the world's knowledge is in published books. And most online content on the internet is, of course, monolingual. It's in English. Most academic content is in English. So the internet is extremely monolingual and, as we recognize, primarily, therefore, monocultural. Why is this important? Because, of course, so much of the Wikimedia world, so much of Wikidata relies on what we call reliable sources. And that is published material, peer-reviewed journal articles and books. So let's look at the infrastructure in terms of the people in academia. I just did a quick digging through academia in the UK, which is where I'm now located. I know this is ironic. As an Indian, I'm now in the land of my empire. So it feels particularly poignant and powerful to me to do this research. And I found, to my unsurprising horror, that academia in the UK is extremely biased and skewed. There are only 140 Black professors from over 21,000. 68% of all full professors are white men, and just 25 Black women are full professors in the UK as of the time of this research. That, of course, then extends to the resources available to non-white students and to the governance of the education sector as a whole. I would urge all of you in different parts of the world to do this research and to see what academia that we do rely on as Wikimedians feels like to you in terms of structures of power and privilege in your context. In other words, published and online knowledge, scholarship and scholars, reliable sources do not read, look, and sound like most of us in the world. In other words, as Wikimedians, it is not just nice to have, but it is a must-have that we think about how to decolonize the internet and how to decolonize knowledge, because these skews and biases are not accident. They happen through the historical and ongoing structures of power and privilege that are primarily coming from colonization, but also, of course, interlocked with systems of oppression like patriarchy, homophobia, casteism, and racism, which is a primary process of production through colonization. So how do we at Whose Knowledge think about this? How do we resist and reframe and reimagine? We start with the radical notion that people are knowledge. And I would urge you again to look at the film that Achal Prabhala created for the Wikimedia movement in 2011, available on the Commons. It is, in fact, about oral citation, but about so much more than that. Well, if we start with people being knowledge, let's look at what that implies for us as Wikimedians and the reliable sources that we so powerfully use. And let me just say, I understand why we need to use reliable sources, but I also urge all of us to think far more creatively and imaginatively and powerfully about how to extend that notion to what reliability involves and what sources involve. I'm going to, somewhat ironically, because these are concepts that have been used and embodied and lived as lived experience of so many of us from the global South, Black and brown women, feminists, anti-racists, gay and queer folks of different kinds. We have talked about the lived experience of our own knowledges in multiple ways. But today I'm going to use a couple of frames that come directly out of Europe. That is firstly from Michael Polanyi, the Hungarian-British physical scientist, who talked about tacit knowledge, what I am calling embodied knowledge. And he talked about the process in which embodied knowledge becomes formal or disembodied knowledge. What Polanyi said was this: when we create artifacts from embodied knowledge, that allows us to claim a formality to it, that allows us to claim institutional authority. So for instance, a wonderful expert dancer of the samba in Brazil is interviewed about her dance, and a video is taken of her brilliant performance. Now that video and audio then get put into an archive of a library or a museum, metadata slapped on it, Wikidata items may be created of it, and through that process, we are constructing a system of formal knowledge, of artifact that has institutional authority. And of course, this is a recursive process, but the question to ask ourselves is, who in the world has the resources to create these forms of formal knowledge artifact? And that brings us to the other frame that we often use of epistemic injustice, of knowledge injustice. This frame is taken primarily from the feminist British philosopher Miranda Fricker, but we push it far more, and I will explain how and why, and we push it in directions that many others have taken it before and after Miranda Fricker's work. However, for the Wikimedia movement, this classification, this typology is useful. Fricker talks about epistemic injustice as being two kinds, one testimonial and the other hermeneutical. Testimonial, to put a complex notion relatively simply, is when you don't believe someone because you don't believe the community they come from. And that might be, for instance, police on the streets of Sao Paulo, Rio, London, New York, not believing a Black man. Hermeneutical injustice is when you don't believe the very concept that someone is embodying or expressing. For instance, sexual harassment, when a woman talks about sexual harassment in a patriarchal society that refuses to accept the concept even exists. And of course, these are interlocked and intersecting. Black women are disbelieved and undermined far greater and far more than, for instance, potentially white women. And these are all nested within each other. But I think the key way in which we push this notion is to recognize that epistemic injustice is not just about ways of knowing, it is also about ways of being and ways of not knowing and not being, because of the underlying structures of power and privilege that are foundations to who gets to know, who gets to be seen in ways that are powerful and affirmed. Let's use Wikimedia and Wikipedia as a proxy to think about this, right? Again, as someone who is a proud Wikimedian, who loves what I do, who loves my communities, and yet sees that we have so far to go still, it's a reminder that even at the very basic level of who is part of our community, only 10% of Wikipedians are women or non-binary folks. Only about 20% of the public online knowledge that we produce is produced on or by people from the Global South. And many of you know this map, but it's useful to remind ourselves again. Mark Graham and his team at Oxford Internet Institute did this in 2012 of geotagged articles at the time, and found that there were more Wikipedia articles inside this little circle of Western Europe than the rest of the world. They went back to this in 2018 with a slightly different form of visualization. And while we can see that the situation has improved through the extraordinary efforts of so many of us across the movement, as we know, it's still so far to go. And this is true of the gender gap. And it's one of the things that we at Whose Knowledge work on with so many of our friends and compañeras across the Wikimedia movement and beyond. The biographies of women in Wikipedia are such a thin slice of the total number of biographies in any language, 18% in English, as we know. And that has been such an effort to move it from 15, 16% as it was before. And the invisibility is not just about the text of the biography, but once you have a biography of women, how many of them have pictures and images that make these extraordinary women visible? Again, only about a fourth of them. And why is this important? I'm not going to belabor an obvious point that all of us know, but I think it's important to remind newbies to the movement and remind us oldies as well why this is important. Because the inequities that we see, feel, or don't see, and don't feel, and don't understand within our projects are inequities that crawl across the internet, that are in fact amplified across the internet because Siri and Alexa and the Google Knowledge Graph and every other third-party content provider takes our incredibly generous, open, free and open source knowledge databases for their own. And that is why we have to make sure that we are thinking with great thoughtfulness around the ways in which we can be better, we can do better. So let me just come to a few design principles and protocols that we at Whose Knowledge use. I'm going to go through them very quickly and then end with some thoughts for Wikidata. At Whose Knowledge, we are rooted very firmly in a power analysis. All of our work starts with who has the power. We ask the questions repeatedly, sometimes multiple times in the everyday, but it's become part of our DNA to ask who does what, who gets what, who's setting the agenda, and who decides what. And why is this important? Because of course, prejudice or bias moves from an individual to a group to a system. This is structural, even though it gets embodied in individual or group dynamics. And for us as Wikimedians, we must always ask the question, whose story are we telling? What is the story? Who is the storyteller and curator of the story? And by story, I mean every form of story that we tell as Wikimedians in the information and the knowledge that we share with the world. Whose knowledge is it? Whose artifact is it? Whose data is it? And of course, for Wikidata, as is key, whose systems of categorization, whose taxonomies, whose ontologies are we talking about? And in order to ask these questions with real structural understanding, it's not just at a surface level, not just about experience, it's about whose design, whose imagination, and whose leadership is constructing the system of knowledge we inhabit. So we center the leadership and design inspired by the imaginations of the marginalized majority of the world. We center the leadership and design of the communities that we work with, support, and are inspired by every day. And that means we are centering, for instance, the kind of challenging work that Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai-Smith asked us to do in decolonizing methodologies around Indigenous peoples, around Black and Brown folks, around women, around gay and queer, non-binary and genderqueer folks, around all of us who have been in multiple different dynamic intersections of dispower and disprivilege through history and through the current times we live in. So to resist is to retrench in the margins, to remake, to reimagine. And imagination is such a core part of what happens through colonization. Colonization is not only about physical, tangible resources. Colonization takes away the ways in which our imaginations can be seen, can be affirmed, can be understood, can be celebrated. What does it mean to construct a structured data system that is not just a taxonomy or an ontology or a categorization of the systems of oppression that have led us to the world we live in, but to the systems of joy and pleasure and imagination, creativity that would allow us to be the fullest of our human selves? That is the Wikidata that I would like to see. And that, I imagine, is the world that Audre Lorde is pushing us to think about in terms of self-definitions. We have centered and supported multiple communities across the world, but what we do with those communities in very many different ways, and I'm going to just talk about a couple, is we do collaborative writing. We create our own artifacts and our own citations, which is, as we know, a radical thing for Wikimedians, but we are creating both artifact and citation in a collaborative way. One of the articles we have written together is this one from the International Feminist Journal of Politics called Centering Knowledge from the Margins, Our Embodied Practices of Epistemic Resistance and Revolution. We have also self-published together with our communities, Our Stories, Our Knowledges, which is particularly about how we bring our knowledges online, including onto Wikimedia projects. So please have a look if you haven't already. And most importantly, as Whose Knowledge, we recognize that the work is of reparations and of justice, not only of representation and solutionism. How do we make this easy for ourselves? Because the work we're doing is complex. And of course, as Wikidata contributors, as Wikidata technologists, this is true. The work is complex. But I'm here to tell you, you are not making the work complex enough. And you are at the same time not making the work simple enough by looking around you at the richness and at the brilliance of all the many communities around the world who can help you think about how to do this differently. And that means it is not about adding women and stirring. It is not about adding the global South and stirring. It is not about adding Indigenous folks and stirring. It is about rethinking the frames, the very structures of the ways we do our work. For us at Whose Knowledge, one very important element is that we do not think of scale and expansion as a factory of homogeneous units. We think about it as a rich textured jigsaw puzzle. This is still a very limited metaphor, but it's a better metaphor than the pin factory. It is a rich textured jigsaw puzzle of many different sized shapes and colors that need to come together. So I'm going to end with some of what this means for Wikidata, and I'm going to start with returning to the notion of epistemic injustice and looking at what it means for justice. So let's look at Wikidata and a notion that I myself struggle often to understand in the depths and brilliance and holistic nature of it, which is the notion of Jukurpa. And that, as Western anthropologists have called it, is dreaming or dream time, which is the notion, the religion, the philosophy, the very reality of life that is understood and expressed by Indigenous Australians or Aboriginals. So what does it mean when we look at the gentleman on the left and think about whether we believe him in terms of testimonial justice and his ways of understanding the world? What does it mean when we look at the image on the right and see it as art, not as an extraordinarily depth-filled, breath-filled, rich, textured notion of life? So this is where I come back to the fact that as Wikimedians, we are selling ourselves short. We are selling ourselves and the world and our mission short when we think about knowledge equity as simply about representation, as about gaps of content and contributors. I myself use that frame because sometimes it's the easiest frame with which to start this conversation, but I don't want that to be the frame we actually use anymore. I'm tired of that frame because it doesn't go far enough. I want us to look at justice. I want us to look at reframes in which we're not just looking at who and what knowledge they can bring to the Wikimedia projects in terms of a taxonomy and an ontology that is constructed by folks from Europe and North America, but from the richness of our full world, right? So what might that mean for Wikidata? Wikidata has come this far and has done so much in 9 years by using a deductive frame, by using, by and large, and I know that there are exceptions, but by and large, a set of ontologies and taxonomies that are top-down, right? Let us construct a global, universal set of frames and set of ontologies, because that's the only way we can do this at the scale that we understand. This is also the way that Wikipedia has functioned, and so it's unsurprising that Wikidata has gone the same way. What will it mean for us to go through an inductive process where we are thinking about scale from the bottom up, from very local context? And by local, I don't mean small. Remember that Bahia is bigger than the size of Spain. Remember that we are the majority, that Europe and North America would get subsumed in the largeness and the textures of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. What will it mean when we think about linked data and big data as a set of linked data sets that are understood, governed, and expressed through different ontological frames of reference, through different groups and communities that express their knowledges in ways that are different from 18th century Enlightenment. And I did a little test of this. I looked up Dreamtime in Wikidata, and you will see that it talks about it as a sacred era in Australian Aboriginal mythology. I then looked at the Commons link, and I found these 8 files. But the image that I wanted, that I've used through this presentation, actually only came up for me when I searched for Aboriginal art. And if you ask any Indigenous Australian how they understand Jakurpa, they may have to use the term art because that is the term that the colonizers have forced them into. That is the term all of us have forced them into, but Jakurpa is not art. It is a form, it is a way of expressing reality. And if I look at Australian reality on Commons, to my amusement and somewhat horror, that's what I get. And let's come back and end with where I began, with this extraordinary Wikidata mapping of terreiros. And the Brazilians will explain this much more beautifully and powerfully than I can. But when you are looking at Afro-Brazilian religions like Umbanda and Candomblé, then what you cannot do easily on Wikidata is to map them because they get mapped onto Christian lexicon. That is the way in which religion is primarily understood on Wikidata, through a Judeo-Christian frame, not through the frames of many of us in the world, not through the frames of Black folks across the world, not just in Africa, but in the diaspora across the world. How do we change that? So as possible next steps, I would like us to think very seriously about how to reframe, to invite, to test and practice. How do we break the silences around the ways in which Wikidata is currently constructed, structured data is constructed in general in the world, and have these necessary conversations? I want to emphasize here that these are not nice to have conversations, that reframing and redoing and expanding the ways we understand structured data is not a nice to have. If we are truly Wikimedians at the core of our mission to understand the extraordinary richness of human knowledges, then this is a must-have. It's not a nice to have, it's not a little pet project we do on the side, it's not conversations to be had when we are, taking a break from doing all of our very important work. And I know I'm sounding a little harsh, but this is tough love again. This is not a nice to have, this is a must have. If the Wikimedia world and communities and movement is to be relevant for the rest of the world, rather than the small slice that we are relevant to right now, then we have to break the silences. We have to do this work. It is complex, it is tough, but it can also be joyful, rich, and incredibly fulfilling as we truly understand the multiple epistemic frames and experiences of the world. So in very practical terms, create an advisory group, bring together brilliant people from multiple epistemic frames, including those who straddle these multiple frames of, enlightenment-driven Western knowledge, as well as others. Many of us within the movement are that. Create that advisory group, test a few community-led processes to understand what it might mean in depth, and then think about what it means to create that jigsaw puzzle at scale, that tapestry. As always, we talk about Wikipedia as being impossible in theory and possible in practice, and I want to remind us that that is true for structured data and Wikidata as well. I think this is not just possible, it is urgent, necessary, and actually a process that is going to be filled with immense joy and fulfillment. So that's the end of my presentation. It's 42 slides, a little sneaky honoring of Wikidata Q42. So thank you, shukriya, obrigada, for listening to me. And I'm very much looking forward to more conversations about this within our movement and across the broader internet and all of our friends in the open knowledge and tech sectors. Thank you very much for having me.